Global economies face challenges as they seek to rebound from the pandemic. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The U.S. economy is now larger than it was before the pandemic, but while new numbers show an upturn, it's slower growth than expected. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund warned the global economy risks losing $4.5 trillion from COVID-19 variants spreading through developing countries with low vaccination rates. For more, we turn to correspondent Giles Gibson. And Giles, take us through some of the latest numbers from the United States. What's behind them?
Well, Mike, on Thursday, we just got the latest numbers for US GDP showing that the US economy grew by 6.5% in the second quarter on an annualized basis. And in a normal year, that would sound pretty good, right? But many economists had been expecting these figures to be at around about 8.4% growth in the second quarter on an annualized basis. Meanwhile, 400,000 people filed for unemployment benefits last week. Again, that sounds pretty high, doesn't it? But it was actually down from the previous week. We also had this week the Federal Reserve announcing that they're going to be keeping interest rates steady at near zero and saying that they see that the US economy is still very much strengthening in the wake of this coronavirus crisis that started in 2020. There's been a lot of speculation, Mike, on Wall Street about when the Fed will start to taper. That's a sort of financial term. It means really rein in its bond buying program, which has been pumping tens of billions of dollars into the economy every month. The Fed dropped a few hints here and there about tapering, but really they didn't give us any sort of a timeline about when that might happen and when they'll feel confident enough to start sort of turning off those taps.
It'll be interesting to watch for that. The International Monetary Fund also out issuing its latest economic update and warning of a pandemic-driven growing gap between the rich and the developing countries. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the IMF's World Economic Outlook projecting 6% global growth in 2021, but warning about this stark difference between wealthy economies like the United States and developing economies, and that gap just getting wider as every single month goes by. In terms of the US economy, they actually raised their projections for the US. They're predicting 7% GDP growth as a whole in 2021 and then 4.9% in 2022. But they actually slashed their projections for lots of different developing economies all over the world, really blaming that on two things, really, saying that wealthy nations like the US, like the UK, like France, have access to a lot of vaccines. And these countries also can pass these massive spending bills like we've seen here in the US, these spending bills of trillions of dollars to help their economies keep going during these difficult times. Developing economies, Mike, just simply can't afford to do that.
No, they certainly cannot. Thanks so much, Giles. Giles Gibson reporting for us from Washington. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. John Gong is an economics professor at Beijing University at International Business and Economics. He joins us from right here in Washington, D.C. Rajiv Biswas is Executive Director and Asia-Pacific Chief Economist at IHS Markit, a business consulting firm. Also with us is John Quelch. He's a Vice Provost at the University of Miami and Dean of the Herbert Business School. And Ryan Patel is a Global Business Executive and a Senior Fellow at Claremont Graduate University's Drucker School of Management. And Ryan, we're going to put you in the hot seat. Break down these numbers for us. As Giles said, they're looking at 6.5. They were hoping for more like 8.5. So it's a good news, bad news situation. Although the overall numbers may be somewhat disappointing, the economy is above that pre-pandemic peak. So what does it tell us more broadly about where we're at and some of the hurdles ahead?
Well, I'll take the good news. At least we're positive, and there is some strength to it. And yes, it didn't hit the estimates, but 6% isn't bad compared to any other quarter that you look at. I think really what you have to look at what was leading to the acceleration, and let's be honest, is two words: consumer spending. That was what was thrown behind this. It wasn't so much the stimulus checks. Obviously, the reopening of the economy and the continuation of the vaccination that started by the end of last year, you started to see an uptick. So those same dynamics it's so important. And if you just take back into the personal consumption side, the consumer spending rose around 6.4% in the second quarter, the highest since 1982. So with all that good news, now you mentioned there is some bad news, and the wild card here is the Delta variant, and really, can the U.S. economy continue without trying to restructure? I don't know if they're going to go back into lockdown, which I don't think many are expecting, but keeping that confidence, travel, food, energy, in all those sectors were all growing, and so I think to me then puts a really pressure on supply constraints, labor shortages, and all those put together. And so, we're not, the U.S. economy is not out of the wood. It needs to continue to building and not take a step back to hit those high estimates.
So Ryan, let me ask you a follow-up on that, because, it's interesting, the talk of mask mandates coming back. I mean, you're talking about consumer confidence. All these people cooped up in their houses, finally out to go on vacation, spend all this money, and now it's kind of a talk of maybe retreating, going back to where they once were. What does that do to consumer confidence?
You're right, Mike. It is hard, because I think jumpstarting the economy again, to have that conversation compared to last year, it becomes hard for businesses to survive. Many of them obviously were able to get over the hump. That's why I think this ability to suppress the variant and be able still to serve the consumer matters. And Mike, these businesses and obviously individuals taking advantage of the money they have going out is a boost that the economy needs, and continues to need over not just 2 months, but at least for the rest of the year going into next year.
Rajiv, you look at the overall U.S. economy, it contracted about 19% from its peak in the fourth quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of last year during the pandemic. So I want to get your thoughts on this, the second quarter numbers, but also unemployment claims. Giles touched on this. Back in January, they're at about 900,000. They've dropped about 400,000. So the unemployment claims coming down. What does that say about the U.S. economy and basically the road ahead?
I think the big picture is still very much about a strong U.S. recovery. So although we can look into the details of the second quarter data, what we're seeing is that the U.S. consumer has shown quite a strong recovery in the first half of this year. And our expectation is that there's going to be continued strong momentum coming from the consumer in the second half and also going into 2022. One of the challenges that the U.S. faces is that the vaccine rollout rates have started to slow down, because there's still a high proportion of the population who are hesitant to be vaccinated. So I think that presents one of the downside risks to the outlook compared to, say, the UK economy, where you've seen a much higher uptake of vaccines. But nevertheless, the big picture is of substantial recovery. And that is being shown very strongly in the trade data between Asia and the US, where we've seen throughout the first half of the year very strong US import demand for exports out of China, exports out of Southeast Asia. So I think those kind of big picture numbers on consumption and trade are still showing a picture of a relatively strong U.S. recovery. We also do monthly surveys, the IHS Markit manufacturing and services surveys for the U.S. economy, and the latest survey results for July still show a pretty positive picture for the outlook for manufacturing and for services in the second half of the year.
So good news there. John Quelch, but you're in the South there in Florida, and we're kind of seeing things rather uneven in terms of vaccination rates. Some parts of the country, not so bad. Southern states, not so great. Does an uneven vaccination rate also equate to an uneven recovery?
Thanks very much. I think that in Florida, what we have is an economy that's heavily dependent, of course, on social activity, whether it be hospitality, travel, tourism, and such pent-up demand in the United States as a whole has resulted in a significant surge of demand in Florida for these services. It's very difficult, for example, to get a hotel room this weekend in Miami Beach. And consequently, there is a large number of people who are typically young people who consider themselves invincible and maybe have not been vaccinated. A large number of young people partying and wandering around the tourist resorts in Florida. And, you know, that is going to have potentially an impact. And the Miami-Dade County authorities have just announced that they're recommending mask wearing be resumed in public by all visitors and all citizens of the county.
John Quelch, so let's stay with another issue, which is inflation. A lot of people talking about that now and concerns about that. Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve commented on it. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your thoughts on the other side.
As the economy continues to reopen and spending rebounds, we are seeing upward pressure on prices, particularly because supply bottlenecks in some sectors have limited how quickly production can respond in the near term. These bottleneck effects have been larger than anticipated, but as these transitory supply effects abate, inflation is expected to drop back toward our longer-run goal.
So he has a pretty optimistic view on inflation, but the supply chain, obviously an issue. But what's your sense on inflation? How concerned are you about it?
I'm a little bit more concerned about it than the Fed chairman is articulating. The position of the Fed is that these inflationary pressures are temporary and that they will abate once these supply chains, whether they be of goods or of labor, are sorted out. But the reality is that a lot of companies are taking advantage of the current surge in demand to raise their prices independent of input prices, raise their prices to consumers. And once those prices are raised, it's extremely difficult to have them come down later. So I'm not so optimistic that we're going to see these prices relax after the supply chain is recovered.
John Gong, I saw you nodding your head, so I want to get your thoughts on that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the Chinese economy, 8% up in the second quarter, indicating it's bouncing back nicely. But is China also facing some headwinds?
You're absolutely right. Actually, the second quarter GDP growth is 7.9%. It's a little bit less than 8%, certainly less than market expectations. I think even though China's economy is indeed recovering, we are still seeing the economy inevitably being affected by these many outbreaks. You know, we see earlier in the second quarter happen in the city of Guangzhou. Now it's happening in the city of Nanjing, and it's now spreading to many places in China. So I think this virus is very stubborn. You know, even in the context of very strict measures implemented by the government, it's still very difficult to really hold the virus at bay, given the inevitable exchanges of goods and services and people between China and the rest of the world. So I think this testifies to a very important tenet that nobody is safe unless everybody is safe, and vaccination should play a very important role here. And I think this is something that the international community falls grossly short. Even though the United States, China, and the developed world are really leading ahead in terms of vaccination rate, but in the developing world, in many countries, its situation I think is just pathetic. So the world won't be able to back to a prior 2019 situation before the pandemic, unless I think a large percentage of the population throughout the world are entirely vaccinated.
And Ryan, this was a big week here in Washington. We're talking infrastructure, which we've been talking about for a long time, but it seems like there was some headway this week. They're actually moving ahead. They're going to consider this bipartisan $1 trillion plan. It's talking about bridges, roads, broadband, rail, transit, water. Joe Biden also calling this a jobs bill. What do you make of it, and how difficult, I hate to use the metaphor road since we're talking about roads, but how difficult a road forward are we watching in terms of actually getting this to his desk and getting a signature?
Yeah, it's still very difficult. I mean, if you think about it, his plan was 2.25 trillion as a proposal in March. Obviously now they've agreed to 1 trillion, and obviously the deal, as you mentioned, calls investors around 110 billion in roads, bridges, and major infrastructure projects, which he wanted 149 billion, that was initially requested in what you would call the American Jobs Plan. And part of why this American Jobs is involved and why he calls it the jobs involved in it is to revisit and kind of grow those smaller towns that lost jobs. That this project will provide that economy and would save many of the, especially Midwest and other places, cities that he hadn't. And to get it to the finish line, I still think there's a lot, this bill is just not about that, as you and I both know. There's a lot of other things that are stuck in there that still needs to be negotiated and probably going to go back and forth in Congress. But I think Congress knows that this is something really important. We've been talking about it for a very long time, and I think it's time to put this in place because it will push the U.S. economy forward should this start to happen and have a better infrastructure to get things from even west to east coast.
John Gong, normally I talk to you, you're in Beijing, you're here in Washington. I just want to get your observations on this debate about infrastructure, because when you talk to some economists, they will tell you that they feel like that fueled the economic growth in China. Infrastructure, a big part of what China's been about with the high-speed rail, all of that. Now it's being exported with the Belt and Road. What's your view, being here in Washington, watching this debate about infrastructure here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, from my observation, it's just too sad that this thing has been dragging on for so long. Now, remember, in the middle of the Trump administration back in 2018, his economic advisor, Gary Cohn, had a big infrastructure plan and gone nowhere. Now, this is already more than 6 months into the Biden administration, and we're still talking about trying to pass this in Congress. I'll give you another example. When our family moved to this area, McLean, Virginia, they're already talking about building the Silver Line to Dallas Airport. I mean, 10 years have passed, a decade has passed, it's still not there yet. So, this is something that, I feel very sad about, what's going on in the United States in terms of political gridlock, in terms of the inaction, the politicians bickering about things, and look at the debate about this infrastructure bill. There are all kinds of things stuffed into this that, in my view, shouldn't be part of the negotiation at all. But for some reason, it's still dragging on. So I'm still hopeful that this bill will eventually pass. But I hope it won't be passed by the end of the year. He only has 4 years, and 1/4 of the year is going to be 1/4 of his administration will be gone very fast. And we're still debating at this point.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with McLean, Virginia, that Silver Line is just a small stretch of subway line, nothing like the bullet train from Beijing to Shanghai. John Quelch, what are your thoughts on this wrangling that continues about infrastructure, which is desperately needed? I mean, a lot of these bridges and roads haven't been, touched in decades.
Well, I agree with John. Of course, it's a Christmas tree bill, and the stretching of the definition of infrastructure to include all sorts of human capital type concepts, including mental health. Those are worthy issues, but they are not part of what one normally considers to be an infrastructure bill. And I think that part of the problem here is that while on the surface it looks like a clever idea to redefine the word infrastructure, in fact it renders the consideration of the content of the bill in the context of congressional committees and the way the Washington bureaucracy works, it renders that extremely difficult because committees that normally would not be involved in an infrastructure bill have now got a stake in it, and this just is muddying the water and delaying what John has indicated is so essential, which is to get the bridges, the airports, the roads, and the high-speed rail invested in.
Rajiv, let's broaden this out, talk a little bit more about the world economy. The International Monetary Fund saying that the world economy risks losing $4.5 trillion from those highly infectious COVID variants. They're spreading through these poor countries which are not getting vaccinated. Let's listen to the chief economist for the IMF, Geeta Gopinath.
Well, the global economy in terms of growth is projected at 6%, which is unchanged from April. The composition has changed. We have an upgrade for advanced economies offset entirely by downgrade for emerging and developing economies. And that is the big concern, because it was already diverging and that has exacerbated in this period. It's a reflection of some very big fault lines that are growing, which is one is unequal access to vaccinations. The second is that fiscal support is much easier to maintain in advanced economies which have easy access to financing.
Rajiv, you know, this inequality, we've heard about it, and we've been hearing, you know, for months now, the richer nations need to step up, and there's still this gap. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, clearly, there is this divergent growth path that we're seeing between the developed countries, North America, Western Europe, and actually I would also include China in that group of highly vaccinated countries that are leading the global recovery. And we're seeing quite strong growth momentum in China. We've talked about the US already, but also in Europe, quite strong recovery. On the other hand, the developing regions are seeing a lot of setbacks right now. Particularly we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific region that the outbreak of Delta variant COVID waves is really starting to become a very big hurdle to economic recovery. In Southeast Asia, India already had a big Delta wave just a couple of months ago, and now it's even spreading in countries like South Korea, which had last year managed to contain the pandemic. So this presents quite a major hurdle to the path of recovery in the second half of the year. And even more so in other regions such as Africa, Latin America. So I think it's definitely one of the most urgent priorities for the global economy to have a coordinated response, probably through the multilateral agencies to try to accelerate vaccine rollout.
Really good point there. Ryan, let me ask you about the disparity, though, because there was the Telegraph had a piece earlier this month that said, all talk, no jabs, talking about all of these pledges, but actual disbursements are minuscule from these richer nations. What needs to be done? Because obviously, if we can't get this thing handled all across the world, it's going to keep moving and the variants will be everywhere.
Yeah, and I think the lesson learned, or the lesson that it will be learned, is that when you're taking, when we live in a global economy, right? When you keep taking care of yourself, you've got to get to a point where you also got to help others, because it's going to help you back. Like if you think about pre-pandemic, the global economy was humming because what? All nations, developed nations, were helping underdeveloped nations to help infrastructure, trade would be better deals for the bigger countries. And now, because of what's going on, this is more than just providing vaccine. If there needs to be an interest, it needs to be able to help besides a humanity aspect, but from an economic aspect. The faster that the underdeveloped countries are catching up, then there's more business to be had. Otherwise, there's going to be a stunt growth. And that's what we're going to see should that not occur, Mike, because you're not going to see these multiples of 10%, 12% GDP, or maybe back to 2 to 3% if you don't have trade partners who's going to help you grow, because you can't do it by yourself. We saw that pre-pandemic.
John Quelch, Europe also dealing with these variants, and we're seeing some issues there as well. As you look at that landscape, what are some of your concerns?
Well, as has been said, the poor get poorer in this kind of situation, and what we see in the domestic economy, where poorer, underserved communities have less access to the vaccines domestically, exactly the same scenario plays out internationally. One of the key problems internationally, though, is that these vaccines require intense refrigeration. And as a result of that, the so-called cold chain into developing economies is simply not that well developed to be able to accommodate, especially the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which require that extra level of freezing in order to sustain their viability. So it's not an easy wave of the wand to solve this international vaccine access problem. And I think that's a major concern, not just in the short term, but in the longer term. We need new technologies that thermally stabilize vaccines so they don't have to have that intense refrigeration in order to maintain their efficacy.
John Gong, we've seen China stepping up to the plate, sending vaccines all around the world. Talk to us about these Asian countries, the poorer ones that are slumping. Is there more China can do to kind of lift them up, and how do you see them as playing a major role in the global economy in the year ahead?
Well, I think the Chinese government is doing all they can to try to help these countries. In China, they export a lot of vaccines, especially in South Asia countries. But the issue, I think, is that it's not enough. I think, and also my understanding is that the WHO's approval process for the other types of vaccines coming out of China is actually quite slow. You already have the 3 vaccines approved by the WHO from the United States. I think, I hope that what Biden has promised can be really delivered. So I think hopefully United States government can really step up and at least I think can help the Western Hemisphere. The developing countries in South America and Central America. These countries at least can be helped by the United States. I also want to offer a comment on this, what's called a forked recovery. This is a historic proven pattern after a pandemic like this. It's not just applies to relationships between countries, it also applies to relationships between the rich people and the poor people in a very advanced economy like the United States. Here, we have seen that people who have good jobs, who have office work jobs, they are staying at home. Their paychecks are not being so much affected. They go to Home Depot and buy all this lumber to do home improvement projects. And the people who are working in restaurants, in hotels, who are renting homes that are suffering from this. And the same analogy can be applied to the developing countries and developed world. The United States economy experienced a very robust growth after the 1918 Hispanic for a period of 10 years in the 1920s. Whereas the poorer countries really suffer. So I think this unfortunate pattern, and this is also exacerbated by the vaccine situation. Back in 1918, we don't have vaccines, but now we have vaccines. But the issue is that this vaccine distribution is uneven across the developed world versus developing countries. So I think this is more of a problem that has to be addressed by the world leaders, by the developed leaders, and we have to address this together.
John, quickly if you can, we got about 20 seconds. The other issue, of course, is not just the pandemic, it's climate change. We're seeing the flooding in Zhengzhou, we're seeing it in Germany, we're seeing these fires in the western United States. Talk to us about how that's going to impact the global economy. And again, we only have about 20 seconds. John Gong?
Oh, yeah. I think this has something to do with the climate change. I think I've read some articles about this is not just on and off thing. This is becoming a trend. We are seeing more and more frequent floods in the United States. The western part of the United States is becoming drier and drier. Lake Mead in California and Nevada. The Lake Mead the water level is just coming down year after year. So I think this is something that the non-believers of the climate change, they have to change their mind. We have to do something about it.
Yeah, it's going to be an issue, no doubt about it. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.